The circular openings in the snow were barely visible, 8 small dark spots against the white expanse that had buried everything for 7 days. Elias Hartwell pushed open his cabin door and stepped into dawnlight he hadn't seen in a week, breathing air that should have killed him 3 days ago. The sky had cleared to pale blue, the kind of cruel beauty that follows catastrophic storms in the Montana wilderness. Around him stretched an ocean of white, pristine, and deadly, broken only by those 8 openings still pulling air down into the earth, still breathing, still proving that a man with enough obsession and intelligence could survive what killed everyone else. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories of frontier innovation and survival move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The year was 1841, and the Rocky Mountain fur trade was entering its slow decline. Beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction across vast territories, and eastern markets were shifting toward silk, but men still ventured into the high country, seeking fortune or freedom. Elias Hartwell was one of these men. He had spent 4 winters in the mountains, trapping beaver and marten along the tributaries that fed the Yellowstone River in what would later become southwestern Montana. He was competent, careful, and partnered that season with a man named Thomas Brennan, an Irish immigrant who had come west 3 years earlier after his wife died of cholera in New York. They had established their winter camp in late October, building a cabin in a sheltered valley surrounded by pine forest. The location was ideal for trapping, far enough from established trails to avoid competition, close enough to beaver ponds to make their work profitable. Their cabin was typical of the era. Logs notched at corners, mud and moss chinked between gaps, a single door, one small window covered with oiled rawhide, and a basic stone fireplace. It took them 6 days to complete. It would keep out wind and snow and provide adequate shelter. That was enough, or so they believed. The blizzard arrived on February 9th. It came without warning, a wall of white that descended from the northern peaks and settled over their valley. Snow fell continuously for 3 days and nights, accumulating at a rate Elias had never witnessed. The wind howled without ceasing, creating drifts that buried everything. On the second day, they stopped going outside entirely. The cabin was surrounded by snow that reached halfway up the walls. The door opened inward, which meant they could still access the interior, but venturing out seemed pointless and dangerous. On the third day, the snow stopped. Elias woke to silence. Thomas was still in his bedroll across the cabin, and Elias assumed he was sleeping late. But when midday came and Thomas hadn't stirred, Elias crossed the small space and shook his partner's shoulder. Thomas was cold, not sleeping, but dead. His face was peaceful, as if he had simply drifted off and never woken. There were no marks of violence, no signs of struggle. The fire had burned down to coals but was still producing heat. The cabin was cold, but not fatally so. Elias tried to understand what had killed his partner. Thomas was 42 years old, strong, healthy, showing no signs of illness. Then Elias tried to open the door for burial preparations. It wouldn't budge. Snow had piled against the exterior, creating pressure that made the inward opening door impossible to move. Elias pushed harder and finally cracked it open enough to see outside. The snow was 5 feet deep against the cabin walls. The window was completely buried. The chimney was barely visible above the drift line. Elias understood. The cabin had been sealed. The snow had blocked the chimney enough to prevent proper draft. Air couldn't get in. The fire had consumed what oxygen remained, and Thomas had suffocated during the night. Elias stood in that doorway, staring at the wall of snow, and felt something shift inside him. This was a solvable problem, and he had just watched his partner die from it. Elias spent 2 days digging through the snow to create a path away from the cabin. The work was exhausting, cutting through drifts that had frozen solid in the cold that followed the storm. He dragged Thomas's body to a hillside overlooking the valley and buried him in shallow ground, the earth too frozen to dig deep. He marked the grave with stones and stood there for a long time, not praying exactly, but thinking about how death had come, not from cold, not from starvation, not from a bear or a fall or any of the 100 dangers that killed trappers regularly. Thomas had died from something preventable. He had died because their cabin became a sealed box. That realization consumed Elias over the following weeks. He couldn't stop thinking about the physics of what had happened. The snow had blocked the chimney partially, reducing draft. The window was buried completely. The door was blocked by pressure. The cabin had no other openings. The fire inside had burned through the available oxygen, and when it began producing more smoke than flame, Thomas had simply stopped breathing. It had probably been painless. He likely never woke up. But it was entirely, completely, unnecessarily preventable if the cabin had been designed differently. Elias began visiting other trappers' camps as he checked his trap lines that late winter. He paid attention to cabin construction in ways he never had before. He saw the same design everywhere. Single door, maybe a window, one chimney. Every cabin he examined would become a death trap if buried under enough snow. He asked other trappers if they had heard of men dying during storms. The stories came easily. A trapper found dead in his cabin near the Bitterroot Range 2 winters earlier, another found in the Absaroka Mountains the previous year. Everyone assumed they had frozen to death, but Elias wondered now if they had suffocated instead, dying warm beside their fires while snow sealed them in. He became fixated on the problem in a way that worried the few trappers who knew him. They thought grief had damaged his mind. Why was he obsessing over cabin ventilation? Why was he asking about how snow accumulated around structures? Why was he studying chimneys and asking questions about airflow? Elias didn't bother explaining. He was working through something, trying to understand a principle that seemed obvious once you saw it, but that no one had apparently considered important enough to solve. The question that haunted him was simple. How do you ensure breathable air reaches the interior of a structure, even when that structure is completely buried under snow? Fire needed air. Humans needed air. A cabin needed a way to bring air inside that couldn't be blocked by snow accumulation, no matter how deep it got. The chimney was inadequate because snow could block it. A window was useless because it would be buried. The door was unreliable because pressure could seal it. There had to be another solution. Something intentional, something engineered specifically to solve this exact problem. Elias didn't know what that solution looked like yet, but he knew he would figure it out. Thomas's death demanded it. Spring arrived in late April, melting the snow and opening the mountain passes. Elias completed his trapping season alone, working Thomas's lines in addition to his own. The work was harder without a partner, but it kept him moving and gave him time to think. By early June, he had accumulated enough pelts to make the journey to Street Lewis worthwhile. He packed his furs onto 2 horses and began the long ride east, a journey that would take nearly 4 weeks through territory that was still largely unmapped. Most trappers spent their time in Street Lewis drinking, gambling, and enjoying civilization's comforts after months of isolation. Elias did none of these things. He sold his furs for a fair price, secured lodging at a modest boarding house, and spent his days walking the city streets studying buildings. He examined warehouses with their thick stone foundations. He watched carpenters working on construction projects, paying particular attention to how they framed structures and created ventilation. He visited the waterfront and studied the warehouses where goods were stored in below-ground spaces that somehow remained dry despite being partially underground. He became particularly interested in root cellars and storage facilities that extended below street level. These structures had to manage airflow to prevent rot and moisture buildup. He noticed they often had multiple ventilation shafts, small openings that allowed air to circulate without creating large, vulnerable points. The shafts were often lined with stone or brick to prevent collapse. Some were positioned at different heights to create natural air movement through temperature differences. Elias sketched these designs in a small journal he had purchased, noting measurements and angles. He also spent time at the library, a building he had never entered before in his life. The librarian, a thin man with spectacles, seemed surprised when Elias asked about books on architecture and engineering. Elias couldn't read most of the technical texts, his education having ended at a basic level, but he could study the diagrams and illustrations. He found books showing cross-sections of buildings, revealing how air and water moved through structures. He saw drawings of ventilation systems in mines, showing how fresh air was brought deep underground through carefully designed shaft networks. One illustration particularly captured his attention. It showed a mine ventilation system with multiple shafts positioned in a circular pattern around a central working area. The MPA shafts were spaced evenly, creating redundancy so that if one became blocked, others would continue functioning. The principle was simple but elegant. Multiple small openings were more reliable than one large opening. Distributed access points were harder to completely block than centralized ones. Elias spent 2 full weeks in Street Louis, an unusually long stay for a mountain man. When he finally prepared to return to the mountains in late June, he had spent nearly all his profit, not on supplies or entertainment, but on unusual items. He purchased 60 feet of good rope, a specialized post-hole digger, a canvas tarp, and several sheets of paper on which he had carefully copied diagrams from the library books. Other trappers heading back to the mountains thought his purchases were strange, but Elias didn't explain. He had work to do. Elias returned to his valley in mid-July of 1841. The cabin stood as he had left it, weathered but intact. Thomas's grave on the hillside was marked by wildflowers that had grown between the stones. Elias spent a day cleaning the cabin interior and restocking his supplies, but his mind was already focused on the work he intended to begin. He had the entire summer and fall to test his ideas before winter arrived again. He would need every week of that time. He started with basic experiments, digging holes in the ground around his cabin to understand how different designs performed. His first attempts were crude. He dug holes of varying diameters, from 4 inches to 12 inches across, and varying depths, from 1 foot to 3 feet deep. He left them open and watched what happened over several days. The shallow holes filled with debris and collapsed partially when rain came. The narrow holes also collapsed, their walls caving inward without support. The wider, deeper holes maintained their shape better, but collected water that didn't drain. Elias realized he needed to line the holes with something solid. He began gathering stones from a creek bed half a mile from his cabin, selecting flat rocks that could be fitted together. He dug a new hole, 18 inches deep and 8 inches in diameter, and carefully lined the walls with stones, fitting them as tightly as possible without mortar. The stone-lined hole remained stable even during heavy rain. Water drained through gaps between the stones instead of pooling. The structure held its shape. He dug 4 more test holes, each stone-lined, and positioned them at different distances from his cabin. He wanted to understand how far from a structure these shafts could be placed while still serving their purpose. He also experimented with connecting the holes to his cabin foundation. Using a small trenching tool, he dug narrow channels from 2 of the test holes toward the cabin, angling them slightly upward. He lined these channels with split logs to prevent collapse and covered them with flat stones and soil. The work was backbreaking and slow. Each hole took half a day to dig and line properly. The channels took even longer, requiring careful excavation to maintain the proper angle. Elias worked alone, and by early August he had created a test system of 6 holes positioned around one side of his cabin, with 3 of them connected to his foundation through underground channels. He tested airflow by building a fire inside his cabin and blocking his chimney partially with canvas. Then he lit a candle and held it near the foundation where his channels terminated. The candle flame flickered, pulled by air movement. The system was working. Air was traveling through the channels from the exterior shafts to the cabin interior. The principle was sound. Other trappers passing through the area that summer saw what Elias was doing and thought he had lost his mind. Why was he digging holes around his cabin? Why was he moving stones and building what looked like tiny wells that served no purpose? Elias didn't argue. He simply continued, working, refining his design, learning what worked and what didn't. By late August, Elias had learned enough from his experiments to design a complete system. He sat outside his cabin on warm evenings, sketching plans in his journal by firelight, calculating distances and quantities. The system he envisioned was more ambitious than his test holes. It would require significant labor and materials, but if it worked, it would solve the problem that had killed Thomas. He decided on 8 shafts positioned in a circular pattern around his cabin. 8 was enough to provide redundancy. If snow blocked half of them, 4 would still function. If wind came from any direction, at least several shafts would remain accessible. The number also allowed for even spacing. His cabin was roughly 16 feet by 20 feet. Placing shafts 10 feet from the walls and 10 feet apart from each other created a perimeter that was far enough from the structure to avoid undermining the foundation, but close enough to serve the intended purpose. Each shaft would be 18 inches deep and 8 inches in diameter. The depth put them below the frost line, preventing the ground from heaving and collapsing the structure during freeze-thaw cycles. The diameter was wide enough to allow substantial airflow, but narrow enough that the stone lining would remain stable without mortar. He would line each shaft with carefully fitted stones, creating a permanent structure that would last for years. The underground channels connecting the shafts to his cabin foundation were the system's crucial element. Elias planned to connect every other shaft, giving him 4 channels feeding air directly into the space beneath his cabin floor. The channels would be 2 feet deep, lined with split logs, and angled upward slightly toward the cabin to encourage air movement. He would dig them carefully to maintain structural integrity, then cover them with flat stones and soil to prevent collapse. The final element of his design was the posts. Each shaft would have a wooden post inserted into its center, extending 5 feet above ground level. The posts served multiple purposes. They would mark the shaft locations, making them visible even under deep snow. They would act as navigation aids, allowing him to move between points even in complete whiteout conditions. And they would provide a physical structure he could tie rope to, creating a safety line system around his cabin perimeter. Elias calculated he would need approximately 200 stones for the shaft linings, 8 straight pine poles for the posts, 60 feet of red wool cloth to wrap the posts for visibility, and enough split logs to line 120 feet of underground channels. The work would take weeks, possibly months. Most trappers would have considered it insane, spending an entire season building something that had no immediate purpose, no guarantee of success, and no precedent in frontier construction. But Elias wasn't building for convenience or profit. He was building to survive. Every stone he placed, every channel he dug, every post he set was insurance against the death that had taken Thomas. If another blizzard came and buried his cabin under 6 feet of snow, his system would keep breathing. And if it kept breathing, he would stay alive. Construction began in early September. Elias started by marking the exact positions for his 8 shafts using stakes and measured rope. He walked the perimeter multiple times, adjusting positions until the spacing felt right, and each shaft was positioned optimally relative to the cabin and to each other. Once satisfied, he drove wooden stakes into the ground at each location and began the excavation work. Digging the first shaft took an entire day. The ground was harder than he had anticipated, packed earth mixed with rocks and roots. He worked methodically, using his post-hole digger to remove soil in stages, widening the hole as he went deeper. When he reached 18 inches, he began the stone lining process. He had spent the previous week gathering stones from the creek bed, selecting pieces that were relatively flat and would fit together with minimal gaps. He placed each stone carefully, testing the fit, sometimes chipping edges with a hand axe to improve how they nested together. The second shaft went faster. He had developed a rhythm, understanding how to work the soil and how to fit the stones efficiently. By the end of the first week, he had completed 4 shafts. Each one was solid, stone-lined, and stable. He tested them by pouring water into them and watching it drain through the gaps between stones rather than pooling. The drainage was important. Standing water would freeze in winter and could crack the stone structure. The underground channels were more challenging. Elias began with the channel connecting the northernmost shaft to his cabin foundation. He dug a trench 2 feet deep, angling it gradually upward over the 10-foot distance. The trench had to be wide enough to line with split logs, but narrow enough to cover securely. He spent 3 days on the first channel, splitting logs to create flat surfaces for the lining, placing them carefully to create a tunnel that would not collapse, then covering everything with flat stones and tamping soil over the top. By mid-October, all 8 shafts were complete, and 4 channels connected them to his cabin foundation. Elias cut his posts from straight young pines, each one approximately 6 feet long. He stripped the bark and shaped the bottom ends to fit snugly into the shaft openings without blocking airflow. He wrapped each post with strips of red wool cloth, winding the fabric in a spiral pattern from top to bottom and securing it with thin leather cord. The red would be visible against white snow, even in low-light conditions. He inserted the posts into the shafts, leaving 5 feet extending above ground. They stood like sentinels around his cabin, strange and purposeful. The final test came on a cold October evening. He built up his interior fire, blocked his chimney partially with canvas, and walked the perimeter, checking each shaft. He could feel air movement at every opening. The system was breathing. Air entered through the shafts, traveled through the underground channels, and fed into the space beneath his cabin floor. The principle worked. Now he needed winter to arrive and test it under real conditions. By late October, Elias had completed the basic infrastructure of his ventilation system. 8 stone-lined shafts surrounded his cabin in a circular pattern, 4 of them connected to his foundation through underground channels. The system worked in principle. Air moved through the shafts and channels, feeding into the space beneath his cabin floor. But Elias knew the difference between a working prototype and a system that would keep him alive during a week-long burial under snow. He spent the next month refining every element. The first refinement involved the shaft openings themselves. His initial design left them open to the elements, which worked during tests but would be problematic during actual snowfall. He needed the openings to allow airflow while preventing them from filling completely with snow. He experimented with different covering methods, trying woven willow branches, flat stones with gaps, and canvas stretched over frames. Nothing worked adequately until he developed a simple solution. He created cone-shaped covers from thin split wood, each one positioned over a shaft opening at a slight angle. The cones shed snow while gaps beneath them allowed air to enter continuously. The underground channels required attention as well. During a heavy rain in early November, Elias discovered that water was seeping into 2 of his channels, pooling in low spots and potentially blocking airflow. He spent 3 days excavating and re-angling those channels, ensuring they sloped consistently upward toward his cabin foundation. He also added drainage gaps at strategic points, allowing any water that did enter to seep out through the stone lining rather than accumulating. The work was tedious but necessary for long-term reliability. The connection points where his channels met the cabin foundation needed sealing to prevent air leaks. Elias mixed clay with pine resin and packed it carefully around each channel terminus, creating an airtight seal that directed airflow upward into the cabin rather than letting it escape into the surrounding soil. He tested each seal by building a large fire inside his cabin and using smoke to trace air movement. He could see smoke being drawn down toward the foundation where his channels terminated, confirming air was entering through his system. Testing became Elias's obsession through late November. He would build his interior fire hot and then partially block different shafts to simulate them being covered by snow. He monitored airflow at the remaining open shafts, confirming the system could function with reduced capacity. He tested blocking multiple shafts simultaneously, finding that even with 5 of 8 blocked, enough air still moved through the system to sustain his fire and provide breathable air. After the first significant snowfall in early December, which deposited 18 inches, Elias deliberately covered half his shafts with packed snow. He returned to his cabin, sealed his door and window, and monitored the interior air quality. The fire continued burning without producing excessive smoke. He felt no difficulty breathing. After 6 hours, he checked the covered shafts. Air had created small openings through the packed snow, finding paths even when he had tried to seal them. The system was working better than he had hoped. By mid-December, he had transformed his basic concept into a refined, tested, fail-safe system that could keep him alive through anything winter could deliver. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, snow had already fallen 3 times, covering the valley in a white blanket that would not melt until spring. Elias settled into his winter routine, checking trap lines during clear weather and staying close to his cabin when conditions deteriorated. His ventilation system stood ready, the 8 shaft openings barely visible as small dark circles in the snow, their cone-shaped covers shedding accumulation while allowing air to flow continuously beneath. December arrived with unusual weather patterns. The temperature dropped severely, far colder than normal for early winter. Then the wind shifted, coming from the northwest, bringing with it a pressure system that settled over the mountain ranges and refused to move. On December 14th, the sky darkened to a uniform gray that seemed to press down on the landscape. Snow began falling before noon, not light flurries but heavy, wet flakes that accumulated rapidly. By evening, 6 inches had fallen. By midnight, over a foot. Elias woke on the 15th to a world transformed. Snow was falling so heavily he could barely see 20 feet beyond his cabin walls. The wind had picked up, creating drifts that piled against anything vertical. He went outside briefly to check his ventilation shafts and found them already buried under fresh snow. But when he cleared one and held his hand over it, he could feel air movement pulling downward. The cone covers were working exactly as designed, maintaining air channels even under accumulation. The snow continued without pause. Day 2 brought another 2 feet of accumulation. Day 3 brought more. Elias stopped going outside except to his immediate doorstep to verify his door could still open. The world had become a wall of white, visibility reduced to mere feet. The sky remained dark, not the darkness of night but the oppressive gray-white of a blizzard that blocked the sun entirely. Inside his cabin, even with the fire burning, the light was dim and strange. On day 4, Elias noticed the snow level outside his window had risen above the frame. The cabin was being buried. He could hear the weight of accumulation settling on his roof, a creaking sound that came periodically as new snow compressed the layers beneath. He lit a candle and held it near one of his floor inspection holes. The flame flickered steadily, pulled by air movement flowing up from beneath. The underground channels were functioning. Air was entering through the buried shafts, traveling through the stone-lined passages, and feeding into his cabin. He was breathing air that had traveled through 4 feet of snow to reach him. Day 5 brought the realization that he could not open his door. The snow outside had created enough pressure that pushing outward was impossible. This was the moment Thomas had faced, but Elias remained calm. His cabin was sealed, but it was not suffocating. The fire burned cleanly. The air remained breathable. The ventilation system was keeping him alive. The storm continued through day 6 and into day 7. On the morning of day 8, Elias woke to silence. The wind had stopped. He forced his door open and stepped outside into a world buried under 6 feet of snow. 8 small circular depressions marked where his shafts had kept him breathing. The storm had ended, but the snow remained. The landscape was buried under an accumulation that would take weeks to melt. Elias spent 2 days digging out his cabin entrance fully and restocking firewood. The physical work was demanding after a week of confinement, but it felt good to move, to breathe cold air, to see sunlight again. On the 3rd day after the storm cleared, he began checking on neighboring trappers. The nearest camp was 12 miles south, belonging to a man named William Croft. Elias traveled on snowshoes, the journey taking most of a day through snow that remained 4 to 5 feet deep. He found Croft's cabin partially visible, its roof line barely above the snow surface. There was no smoke from the chimney. Elias called out, but received no answer. He began digging at what he estimated was the door location, working for nearly an hour before he broke through into the interior. The cabin was dark and cold. Croft was in his bedroll, frozen. His face showed no signs of trauma or struggle, just the peaceful expression of someone who had fallen asleep and never woken. The fireplace was full of cold ash. The door had been blocked from outside by snow pressure. The single window was completely buried. The chimney had been partially blocked, evident from soot stains on the walls where smoke had backed up into the cabin. Croft had suffocated, probably on the 3rd or 4th day of the storm, while his fire consumed the last breathable air in the sealed space. Elias stood in that cold cabin for a long time, looking at Croft's body and seeing Thomas. The same death, the same preventable tragedy. Croft had been a competent trapper, experienced and careful. He had simply built a standard cabin using methods that had worked for decades. Those methods had killed him. The second camp belonged to 2 trappers named Henderson and Pierce, 15 miles east. The journey took another full day. He found their cabin similarly buried, but when he called out, he heard a weak response from inside. He dug frantically, breaking through to the door. Henderson was alive but in terrible condition. Pierce was dead beside the cold fireplace. Henderson's story came out in fragments through cracked lips and exhausted breathing. The storm had buried their cabin by day 3. Their chimney had blocked, filling the interior with smoke. Pierce had tried to dig out through the door, but couldn't move it against the snow pressure. The smoke had overwhelmed him first. Henderson had survived by lying flat on the floor, where a thin layer of breathable air remained. He had been trapped inside for 4 days after the storm ended, too weak to break through the door, slowly dying until Elias arrived. Elias helped Henderson reach a larger settlement 30 miles north. During the 3-day journey, Henderson asked repeatedly how Elias had survived so comfortably. Elias explained his ventilation system, the shaft construction, the underground channels, the airflow principles. Henderson listened with the intensity of a man who had faced death and barely escaped. Word spread quickly. The week-long blizzard had killed 6 men across the northern Rockies. All had died the same way, suffocated in sealed cabins. Elias Hartwell had survived in perfect comfort because he had built something no one else had thought to build: 8 small channels that let air flow when everything else was sealed. Word of Elias Hartwell's survival spread through the scattered trapping community that winter and spring. Men who had mocked his strange construction methods the previous summer now sought him out, asking detailed questions about his shaft system, his underground channels, his airflow calculations. The week-long blizzard had killed 6 trappers across the northern Rockies, all from suffocation or smoke inhalation after becoming trapped in their cabins. Elias had not only survived, but had remained comfortable and safe throughout the ordeal, breathing freely while buried under 6 feet of snow. By the spring of 1842, 3 trappers had begun building variations of Elias's system at their own camps. The designs varied based on available materials and individual skill levels, but the core principles remained consistent. Multiple ventilation shafts positioned in a circular pattern around the cabin. Stone-lined openings to prevent collapse. Cone-shaped covers to shed snow while maintaining airflow. Underground channels connecting shafts to the cabin foundation. The technique became known as Hartwell's shafts, though Elias never sought credit or attempted to profit from his innovation. He shared his knowledge freely with anyone who asked, even helping some trappers dig their shafts and construct their channels. His motivation was never fame or recognition. He had watched Thomas die from a preventable cause. Now William Croft, Pierce, and 4 others had died the same way. If Elias's solution could prevent future deaths, that was sufficient purpose. He sketched diagrams for trappers who visited his cabin. He explained the physics of airflow and the importance of redundancy. He demonstrated how to test the system using smoke and candles. Over the following 3 years, the system proved itself repeatedly. The winter of 1843 brought another severe blizzard, not as prolonged as the first, but heavy enough to bury cabins and trap unprepared trappers. Those who had built Hartwell's shafts survived without incident. Those who had not faced the same dangers that had killed Thomas and the others. The statistical evidence was undeniable. The ventilation system worked. Cabins equipped with properly constructed shaft networks could be buried for extended periods without their occupants suffocating. By 1845, the Rocky Mountain fur trade was effectively finished. Beaver populations had collapsed from overtrapping, and silk had completely replaced beaver felt in hat manufacturing. Trappers began leaving the mountains, seeking opportunities in Oregon, California, or returning to civilization. Elias left in 1846, taking his accumulated savings to the Willamette Valley in Oregon Territory, where he purchased land and established a small farm. He married in 1848, started a family, and lived quietly, but the cabins remained. Settlers moving west discovered abandoned structures with strange circular openings surrounding them and shaft systems that served no obvious purpose to those who didn't know their history. Some cabins were reoccupied and maintained by new inhabitants who recognized the superior construction. Others slowly decayed back into the wilderness, their ventilation systems silting closed, their purpose forgotten. The knowledge of why those shafts existed gradually faded as the Mountain Man era ended and new generations arrived who had never experienced week-long blizzards that swallowed the sun. Elias Hartwell died in 1871 at age 54, buried in a small cemetery outside Salem, Oregon. His gravestone mentioned nothing of his time in the mountains or the innovation that had saved lives. But somewhere in the Montana wilderness, 8 stone-lined shafts still drew air into the earth each winter, marking the place where a man's refusal to accept that death from suffocation was inevitable had created something that outlasted him.